What's up, everybody? I'm about to show you exactly how I create my tone. Now, little disclaimer I want to make is that if you're not a guitar nerd and you're not interested in digital effects, maybe you already know a lot about digital effects, this might not be the video for you. It's going to be really long and kind of slow going. But that being said, this is the question that I get asked by and large the most often, and that is, how do I get my tone? So I'm going to tell you exactly how I do that. We're going to go over all the audio effects I use and the settings that they're at. And I'm going to do my best to sort of explain all of it, although I'm not an audio engineer. I'm definitely an amateur when it comes to this, so feel free to correct me if I get any of this stuff wrong. But yeah, let me show you in Ableton Live how I get my tone. Alright, here we are. This is a blank Ableton Live project file. By default there's going to be a bunch of different tracks. We don't need the MIDI tracks, and we only need one audio track, so I'm going to delete all that. And then I'm going to make sure that my input is set to 1. That's where I have my amp plugged into. I'm going to go ahead and turn the monitoring to auto and hit the arm button, and we should have sound. Now this is going to be really quiet. This is just the sound of my guitar and the amplifier that I'm using. So actually, before we get into any of this, I want to talk briefly about what my recording setup is. Sort of outside the computer or pre-DAW, I've got my guitar plugged into a Laney L5 Studio, and then instead of using like a speaker or a cabinet and miking it, I'm using the direct output from the back of the Laney head, and I'm running straight from the amp to the interface. So this isn't quite a direct-in recording setup where I would be plugged straight into the interface, like guitar, no amp interface. This is maybe what you would call like a direct through recording setup. So it's still kind of direct. We're not messing around with mics or speakers or any of that, but it's not pure DI because there is an amp in the chain. Anyways, that's a bit about how I'm recording. Let's talk about the effects that I use. Now, actually, one of the first things I want to do is just show you what the end result is going to sound like so you sort of know what we're working towards. I've got these effects saved as a preset called Guitar Space, and here I'm going to give you the secret to all this stuff. This was actually a preset in an older Ableton version, like 8 I think. There was a preset in the audio effect rack under guitar processing called Guitar Space, and it was literally almost identical to what I'm about to show you. It was a couple versions of Ableton ago, and every time I set this up I do it a little bit differently, but for the most part the settings that I'm about to show you and the 3 effects that we're using, compressor, saturator, and reverb, straight copied that from Guitar Space, an Ableton preset. That's like, so I didn't really come up with this stuff on my own. Now I fiddle with some of it, but for the most part, keep that in mind. This was a preset from an older version of Ableton. Now, like I said, it's a compressor, a saturator, and a reverb, and this is what it sounds like. Do a little before and after. I'm going to turn it off and we have just the clean tone coming from the amp. And now I'm going to turn the effects back on. So you can hear it adds quite a bit of like volume, of fullness and warmth and richness, however you want to say it. It adds a lot of stuff that wasn't there before. Now I'm going to delete this preset, and we're going to go into the audio effects and set it up sort of one by one, going over each effect individually. So I'm going to grab a compressor, a saturator, and a reverb. And I'm going to turn the reverb and the saturator off at first because we're going to go one by one, and I want to start with the compressor. We're going to be doing downwards compression, which is probably one of the most common uses of compression, but this tool, Compressor, is probably, gosh, I would bet this is the most commonly used tool in all of audio engineering because compressors can do a ton of different stuff. It's not just downwards compression like we're going to do, where we take loud sounds and we sort of squash the volume a little bit so they're quieter. Tons of stuff can be done with the compressor, but we're going to be doing downwards compression. Basically, we're going to set a ratio and a threshold, and the threshold is these are sort of the 2 values that you really want to give attention to with a compressor. The threshold is the level at which things louder than this will get compressed at a ratio of what we set here, and things quieter than that will get left alone. So right now, as the default compressor settings, 2-to-1 ratio, 0 dB threshold. So if I was going to play something louder than 0 dB, everything that crossed that threshold would be reduced by a 2-to-1 ratio in volume. Now, Couple things I'm going to set up at first. RMS mode instead of peak. This has to do with what the compressor is looking for when it decides, do I compress this? So if you have peak set up, it's going to look for the peaks in the incoming waveform. If you have RMS mode enabled or whatever, I think that means root mean squared. And I think it looks for an average, or like the mean of the incoming waveform, and sort of reacts a little bit differently. Expand is for a totally different type of compression. Sort of how I mentioned, there's all these different things you can do with compressors. Expansion is the opposite of what we're doing right now. We're doing downwards compression, where loud stuff gets quieter, and the quiet stuff doesn't really get messed with. Expansion is the opposite. The quiet stuff gets raised in volume, and the loud stuff doesn't really get messed with. One thing we sort of always want to make sure we have checked is makeup gain. So it's sort of a common misconception of compressors that they just like add volume and they make things louder. But actually, the kind of compression that we're doing, downwards compression, reduces volume. That's going to make the signal quieter because all it's doing is it's taking the loud stuff and reducing the volume, and it's not doing anything to the quiet stuff. So if we have makeup gain turned off and we do downwards compression, the outgoing signal that's coming out of the compressor is going to be quieter than the incoming signal. We don't want that. We do want this effect. We want compression to add a bunch of volume, but really, that's not the compressor. That's like makeup gain. So let's get our ratio and our threshold set up. Those are the two really important values. By default, the threshold's set to 2. I'm going to go up to like 3, 3.5, 4-ish in that area. It's not exact, but I probably rarely go below a 3-to-1 ratio. And then we're going to take our threshold way down. I'm going to dial in negative 30 dB because basically what we want is literally everything that we play to get compressed. That's sort of one of the big main points and takeaways from my guitar tone, is that the entire thing is compressed. So negative 30 dB is a really low value. Very little of what I'm about to play, or just what I'm going to play in general, is going to be below that. So the overall effect is virtually every single thing that we play is going to get compressed at this 3.3-to-1 ratio. Now, we need to mess with our attack and release times a little bit. I don't really screw around with these that much. I know that I like a fast attack and a fast release. But for clean fingerstyle electric guitar, I don't really spend that much time worrying about the differences in tone that changing the attack and release values will create. If you have a different instrument, one that has like, I don't know, like drums for example, you could probably really change the way drums sound based off of attack and release times of your compressor. But for a clean electric guitar, I haven't felt that it makes that big of a difference. Another thing that we're not going to worry too much about is knee. Right now this is set at sort of a soft knee, 6 dB. I'm going to take it to what would be called a hard knee of 0. Actually, there's a good view, this one. This view of the compressor will show this. So here we have this is just a breakdown of what's happening in the compressor. This big yellow dot is the threshold, and if I play here, the little yellow dot is the level above the threshold. So if there was no compression, actually here we can do this, you'd see what will happen. This line will be straight. You could think of up and down as volume, so the higher this goes, the louder it is. And if we add compression, if going up is volume, and so this is taking a less steep, the trajectory sort of gets altered. So the higher that we change this, the lower that things that cross this threshold are going to be turned down to. Now, let's take this back to like 3.5, that's good. Knee has to do with this area right here. Right now this is a very straight angle. There's not a curve at all, but if we bump the knee up, I'll max it out so you can kind of see. This is sort of a gradual transition where compression actually starts to get applied a little bit before the threshold, and it's eased off once you get above the threshold, as opposed to just a hard, no compression. So this is pretty much how I like to have my compressor set up. 3.5, maybe 4-to-1 ratio, really fast attack, slower but still really fast release, very low threshold, negative 25, negative 30, hard knee at 0, and then makeup gain for sure, and RMS mode. And dry wet we want always at 100%. We really want to use the compressor to change this tone completely, and we don't want any of the dry incoming uncompressed signal to be blended with the compressed signal. Okay, there's one last thing that I want to do, And it's not, you know, if we were just using a compressor right now, these settings might be fine to just leave exactly where they are. This is going to sound pretty good on its own, just for a clean guitar tone. Sounds not bad, right? But what we're going to do with the saturator is add a huge amount of drive, like a lot of drive. So in anticipation of that, I'm going to take the output of our compressor way down, like negative 12, negative 13, somewhere in that range. Because what we're going to do is add a huge amount of drive at the input stage of our saturator. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the saturator on. And actually, even before we add that drive, I'm going to take the output way down. Because again, if we don't do this, we would blow out our speaker. So here we go, negative 24, negative 25. And then I'm going to add 36, I'm going to max out the input drive of our saturator. I'm going to turn DC on. I believe DC and color are two filters. I really don't understand too much of what saturator does, but I know it's an overdrive and that there's a couple filters going on. And I think these are parameters that control, or these control parameters of these two filters. Now, this effect to me is a little bit, it's mysterious. I actually don't know that much about it. Like I said, I know it's an overdrive and I know there's filters, but I really don't know what this stuff does that much. So this effect, more than the others, I'm really just copying the settings from Guitar Space from Live 8. Whoever created that preset, somebody at Ableton, I imagine, found the secret sauce. They found this miraculous combination of saturator settings to produce this beautiful tone. So I don't really know why I'm going to change these to these values that you're about to see, but I just know that they work. So we're going to go to soft sine. We're going to take our bass down to like negative 15, negative 16. Frequency we're going to drop to like somewhere between 8 and 900 hertz. 825 is fine. Width we're going to max out, and depth we're going to bottom out. Now, this is basically it. Compressor setup like this and saturator setup like this is pretty much exactly what my tone sounds like. All that's missing right now is reverb, which doesn't really add all that much in terms of tone. That's really just like room, space and ambience and room noise. But as far as tone goes, it really comes from compressor and saturator at these exact settings. There it is. That's pretty much the bulk of the tone right there. So it's a compressor at a 3.5 to 1 ratio with a super low threshold, so everything gets compressed. We dialed the output way down because we added an insane amount of drive at the input stage of our saturator, but then we turned the output way down so we didn't blow out our ears. And then this crazy concoction of saturator settings is pretty much the secret behind this whole tone. Now, we do need reverb, so I'm going to turn that on. Now, one of the first things I want to do is actually go to this dry-wet knob. Now, with our saturator and our compressor, we really want to benefit from, we want the sound to come into each of those effects and come out sounding way different. So we don't want to blend. If we had these turned down, it would blend the output with the input. And that's not exactly something that we want because we're trying to benefit from the compressor and saturator. We want those to add all this stuff. Reverb is a little different. You basically never, well, no, I shouldn't say never, but for this tone, you don't want to have this dry-wet knob set very wet or very high. If you set this at 0, it's going to be 0 reverb. You're not going to have anything, right? If you set it at 100, it's going to be only reverb. Which is like not what, if our goal is my clean tone, we're nowhere near there. This could be cool if you're trying to make like ambient soundscapes or shoegaze or something, but you basically don't want this value set very high at all. And this is a good rule of thumb. Anytime you're putting a reverb track or a reverb effect directly onto an audio track, instead of here, just in the default Ableton project file, there's a return set up with a reverb on it. This is a much more common way to use reverb. And then you could use these send knobs right here. So if I turned this guy up, this would send this track to this reverb. So this is just to keep this in mind. You want the dry wet knob to be very dry anytime you're putting a reverb directly on a track. But at certain times throughout this, I'm probably going to bump this up a little bit to just really exaggerate what it sounds like so you can hear the effect of some of the parameters we're going to change. But at the end, we probably want this somewhere between 25% and 40% tops. So let's get into it. One thing I think we should talk about first is this little thing right here, global quality, right? There's 3 options, eco, mid, and high. This has to do with how much CPU this effect will use. So if you're on like a laptop and you're struggling for processing power, you have maybe latency problems or this kind of stuff, eco is definitely what you want. I'm on a big old PC, so I'm going to set it to high. And then let's go sort of left to right through this and talk about each one of these things. Input processing is basically EQ, that EQs what's coming out of the saturator and gets sent into the reverb. And I'm not going to do any of this. I'm going to turn, so there's 2 options. You can do a low cut and a high cut, and you can do a little bit of sculpting like this. I'm not going to mess with it. I don't think the guitar, like one clean guitar track, has too many unwanted frequencies or stuff that we really want to shape before the reverb. I'm cool with all of this tone getting sent to the reverb, so not going to mess with the input processing or the pre-delay really. First thing we kind of want to look at is early reflections. Now, you kind of want to think about reverb as being 2 sounds, one initial sound and then one later sound, which inside of the Ableton reverb effect, the first sound is called early reflections, and the later sound is called diffusion network, which you might also hear described as like tail, the reverb tail. So this is like the initial sound, this is like the tail. And what we have here are 2 effects that we can put on both of them. Spin we can put on the early reflections, and chorus we can put on the tail. And each one of these effects has this type of little graph thing to control it, where there's 2 parameters that get modulated. Now, I don't actually know what they are for spin, but you could think of this as like a graph, right? X and Y, where this would be 100% of one value, and this would be 0 of both of them. This would be 100% of the other value, and this would be 100% of both values. So I happen to think spin sounds terrible when it's modulated very heavily. I'll turn the dry wet up and play a little bit so you can hear how trash this sounds. Right? That sounds garbage. So I like to have this dialed way back. Shape, I don't really know what this does, to be honest, but I know it has to do with the early reflections. I think this is maybe modeling like the actual physical shape of the space that you're in. I know that I kind of like a high-ish value, somewhere in the 75% range, mostly because that's what Guitar Space did in Live 8. Now, another setting that we want to look at is this one. Size has to do with, how big this space is that we're modeling, right? And I think ultimately it's sort of like blending between, if you're in a really small space, you're going to have more early reflections. If you're in a really large space, you're going to have more of a tail. The default setting of 100 is pretty good. I might dial it back to like 90, but that's honestly, this would be like a large hall, as opposed to like a small room or an arena or something. This is kind of the middle ground. The stereo knob controls like I believe if it's turned to 0, the reverb is a single mono reverb. And if it's turned maxed out to 120, I believe it's 2 separate reverb tracks, like a left and a right. So depending on how stereo you want your reverb, you can mess with this. I think the default setting of 100 is totally fine. Decay time is a really important one. I don't know the actual figure. It's like 1.2 whatever this value is, it's like that's the time it takes for the reverb tail to be 1/1000th of its initial amplitude or something crazy like that. It's essentially how long does the sound stick around for after we stop playing. So this is 1.2 seconds. You want to listen for how long does the tail last after I stop playing. So that's like roughly 1.2 seconds. We could bump this up to like, I don't know. It's going to be like 2.5, maybe 3, 3.5, maybe 4 is somewhere where I like it. You can hear the sound just sticks around just a little bit longer, teeny bit longer. And again, I have the dry wet turned up higher than I normally would, just so that you can hear some of these changes that I'm making. So it's a much more spacey vibe. Let's look at this. If this was input processing, you could essentially think of this as like output processing. That might not exactly be what it is, but that's how I think of it. There's two filters, like shelf filters, that we can apply. The high one is turned on by default. Now, I'm not very scientific about this at all. I'm just going to drag in some sort of shape that cuts out a lot of the lows and a lot of the highs and leaves sort of the middle ground untouched. And this is basically the tail, or the end of the reverb sound. Now, we can also put chorus onto the reverb tail, sort of like you could put spin on the early reflections. And this is the same type of sort of graph that this is. So like, this would be max one parameter, this would be 0 of both of them, this would be max the other parameter, and this would be both of the parameters maxed out. I like this one dialed pretty far back, kind of like where the spin is at. We're getting pretty close to being done with the reverb. One thing that I will mess with, this knob reflect controls the level of the early reflections. So I'm going to turn this down a little bit, like maybe -3 decibels. And I'm not going to mess around with the diffuse knob, which controls the volume of the diffusion network, or the tail. Now, I am going to turn the dry wet back down to like, I don't know, 25-30 range. That's where I like it. Density and scale, I actually don't know that much about what these do here. We should have been doing this the whole time. If you don't use the info view in Ableton, you're totally missing out. This is like basically the manual for the program, and you like hover over stuff and it tells you what it is. So let's check it. This controls the diffusion network's density. Low values produce thinner sounding echoes. Higher values produce denser ones. Okay, so this would be a medium high, so a dense-ish sound. Scale controls the coarseness of the diffusion. What does that mean? Higher values tend to produce a darker sound. Okay, so a higher value would be a darker sound, and then I guess a lower value would be a brighter sound. So yeah, definitely use the info view tab if you don't, because that's a really good tool. So yeah, that's pretty much it actually. That's my whole tone in a nutshell. Compressor, saturator, and reverb at these pretty much exact settings. I don't know if these are identical to what Guitar Space in Live 8 was, but it's pretty close. Every time I set it up by scratch instead of using the preset, I think I do it a teeny little bit differently, but for the most part, these are the settings that I use. Compressor at a 3.5 to 1 ratio, really low threshold, -30 dB. Turn the output way down because we add 36 dBs of gain at the input stage of our saturator. And then we turn the output way down so we don't blow the speakers out. This totally mysterious but magical combination of knobs down here is really the secret sauce. If there's a part of this that's like it's that. It's the saturator. And then a pretty big hall, but dialed way back, like a very, very, only 25-30% on the dry wet knob. And a decay time of, I don't know, 2.5, maybe up to 4 seconds is probably the max of wherever I have it at. And not too much effects, not too much spin or chorus put on the whole thing, but a little bit of output processing. That's basically it. Now, I see actually here, I'm looking over here, our master, oops, this is that thing I just clicked, this is a peaking indicator, and that actually showed us that I had clipped on a couple occasions throughout this video. So there we go, we're getting real close. That's just under a decibel below 0, and I bet I could clip easily if I just played too hard. There we go. Now let's talk about clipping for just a second at the end. So generally, you want to avoid clipping always. That's a good rule of thumb. You don't want to see red very much ever. In the DAW, it's a little bit different than at your hardware level or your audio interface. You never want to clip your audio interface, ever. You basically never want to clip analog to digital gear. Like an audio interface has these analog to digital converters in there. And if you're clipping, that means the signal that's coming in analog is not fully represented digital on the other end. You mean you're losing information. And what that sounds like is ugly crackling and popping and distortion. It's a little bit different inside of recording software. So I am not particularly worried about the negative effects of clipping one single guitar track in Ableton. If you had a huge composition with dozens and dozens of tracks and all sorts of instruments doing all sorts of things, you probably never want to see red on your master at all. But this is a situation, exactly what we're doing right now, where it's really not the end of the world. You don't lose information in the same way when you clip your master in Ableton that you do when you're clipping your audio interface, like at the first input stage. So it happens to me all the time where I'm usually not looking at I'm not looking at Ableton when I'm recording. I'm trying to, be in the zone for recording or whatever, or the performance, and I'll listen back after I've recorded it and I'll be clipping all over the place. But at the end of the day, it doesn't sound bad to clip a little bit with an electric guitar. So I'm not too worried about it. You could even, like, if you close your eyes right now and I play something, like I clipped a bunch of those chords, and I don't think they sounded bad. I can't pick up any compression artifacts or distortion or overdrive or any of this stuff that's supposed to happen when you clip. So general rule of thumb, avoid it as much as you can, but don't lose sleep over it if you do end up clipping, because especially with just one single instrument, like a single guitar track, it might not even sound bad. That being said, there are a couple ways that we can avoid clipping. Say it's happening to you a bunch and you really need to fiddle with the settings to stop it from happening. The first thing you should go to is the outputs of your compressor and your saturator. So right now I'm at like -12.9 and -24.3. If I took this down to -15 and this to -26, I bet you I couldn't clip if I played as hard as I could. Yeah, we're getting close. But that effectively would have totally stopped that problem from happening. Now, I'm usually going for volume, so I'm going to change these back to sort of where they were, and let's look at a different way that you could reduce clipping, and that's with a limiter. Limiter is another compressor. It's very similar to the compressor effect, except the ratio is like extremely high, basically to the point where things can't cross the threshold. The threshold value, in fact, it's called a ceiling in a limiter. This is the same as threshold over here, where in our normal compressor, when we play, things that are louder than the threshold get turned down at this ratio. In a limiter, things don't get louder than the threshold. It's a hard ceiling. So let's say I have a ceiling of -2 decibels. That means on the master, nothing is going to be louder than -2 decibels. Oops. And if I reset the clipping indicator, you'll be able to see it will max out at 2. Nothing will ever be higher than -2 decibels. And you can see there's a little representation of what the gain reduction looks like. So that's how much the volume is getting turned down when we're hitting our ceiling of -2 decibels. Now this is a great way to, limiters are great. Limiters are awesome little tool. They're good for adding volume, and they're good for adding another sort of layer of compression. And in my experience, you have to push them pretty far. Like we'd have to push the ceiling way down and the gain way up for us to get this sort of ugly compression artifacting that can happen if you overcompress. So that's a decent way to stop clipping, and I do sometimes use limiters on my guitar tricks. Okay, that's it. That is every single aspect of my guitar tone, 100%. I just showed you everything I do. I record from my guitar into my Laney L5 Studio. From the L5 Studio, I go into my audio interface with the direct output from the back. No microphone, no speaker, no cab. And then in the DAW, compressor, saturator, reverb at these settings. And sometimes a limiter if I want to add more volume or more compression or stop myself from clipping. But that's pretty much it. Now, say you don't have Ableton and you have a different DAW. The chances are you may not have saturator. That's sort of the one effect that I've found is unique to live. And one of the reasons actually I like live so much is because of this super cool effect. But you can do without saturator. Actually, if we turn the saturator off, and I'm going to take the compressor output way back up to 0 because we got rid of all of this gain from the saturator, this tone is not going to be that bad. So So that's just the compressor and the reverb and a little bit of a limiter, but even we can turn the limiter off. So just a compressor and a reverb alone don't actually sound that bad if you have the compressor output dialed up to give you, decent amount of volume. Now these two effects, compressor and reverb, for sure your DAW will have. I have yet to come across a DAW that doesn't have a compressor and a reverb stock as included effects. If you want to try to find something to replace the saturator with, I'm going to turn it back on. Like I said, it's basically an overdrive with some fancy filtering going on. So you could experiment with an overdrive, and you don't want breakup. This is a very clean tone that we're going for. So if you do replace the saturator with a drive or a boost or something, maybe have the gain turned way down and the output turned way up. So it's not adding overdrive and distortion, but it's adding volume. That's what I would try, but again, you can totally do without saturator if you just have a compressor and a reverb. So yeah. I hope this was full of good information for you. If you have live, try dialing in these same settings. If you have a different DAW, try to use as many effects from this as you can, compressor and reverb, and dial in equivalent values. One sort of last note that I'll say is that your guitar, your amp, if you're recording into one, these are going to affect your tone significantly. So like a Strat or something else, a PRS is going to sound way different than this guitar. So you should consider these settings for these effects as more of like a baseline for experimentation and exploration than a secret sauce perfect recipe that you apply and then you don't have to touch it. It's just good. That's probably not going to happen. That's basically it. That's every single aspect of my tone, all the effects that I use, and all the settings that I have those effects at. And yeah, I hope this was informative for you. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. I'll do my best to get back to you. And yeah, peace out. Thanks for watching.